Get ready to rumble. Shilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast, today's commentary as the mob turns. I think back to when I was a kid and I read a story, Ray Bradbury, one of my favorite authors, and one of his books, which I read multiple times in my life, was called The Martian Chronicles. And one of the chapters, one of the most memorable chapters, and I don't know why it struck me so as a child, but it did and it still does, was about a shapeshifter. It was an entity that was able to appear to various people as someone they wanted it to be, a person who had been lost to them in the past or some other person important to them in their life. And the shapeshifter possessed great empathy. So whenever the shapeshifter came before a person or a group of people, it started to change into the shape of whoever that group or individual wanted it to be. And eventually the shapeshifter was completely depleted and died. The empathy of the shapeshifter killed a good heart, and that entity, the shapeshifter, was no longer available to help other people in the way that it wanted to. And that story made a huge impression on me over the years. So let's talk today about the history of the mob, keeping the shapeshifter in mind. And I always like to go back to the French Revolution, which was a massive failure because it was a godless revolution compared to the American Revolution, which was based on godly principles. And you think of somebody like Robespierre, who was adored and later consumed by the mob and beheaded along with a lot of others in the French Revolution. You see, when you're in the mob or you're trying to lead the mob, at some point the mob will turn on you, and that will be the end of you. Well, we've seen that history play out in Dave Norris' situation, also in the situation of West Bellamy. You'll remember Dave Norris was a favorite of the mob back in the days when Lee Park was occupied. And then when Dave Norris finally had to meet reality and order the occupiers who had been in the park illegally for a month out of the park, Dave Norris was burned in effigy. And of course, there were chants of F Dave Norris, F Dave Norris. You can imagine what the F stands for. It was all captured on tape. Similarly, West Bellamy, who tried to control a mob during his time in city council and was eventually turned on by that very mob and run out of office, couldn't even get signatures on his petition to get back on the ballot. And fascinatingly, West Bellamy, who was at an event recently in Charlottesville, another mob event where the streets were taken over, was talking on the subject of defunding the police and said it was more figurative, and of course the mob turned on him there as well. You see, the mob is never satisfied until it consumes you. And now we have Mayor Nikiah Walker, who has long courted the mob in many ways. You know, Mayor Walker is a friend of mine, and I do talk to her regularly on the air. Ran on a platform of unmasking the illusion, and over time, and in my interviews with her, she has been willing to unmask the illusion to some extent. But the question is, have there been compromises in her transparency over the years? And I think very recently in a settlement of the city with Tanisha Hudson, I'm sure Mayor Walker knows exactly what that settlement was and yet will not tell the public, or at least hasn't yet. And I think there have been other times when the mayor has seen her best intentions meet reality and has been unable to live up to the expectations of the mob, many of whom put her there with certain expectations, again, not met. Then we have Police Chief Brackney. I think when you are a police chief, you either must stand for law and order, or you stand with the anti-police social justice warrior crowd. You cannot straddle the fence. That hurts, and eventually you will fall off. Walking the line in between the two of those, you pretty much lose everyone. So we hear there's an exodus going out of the Charlottesville Police Department, and it's very difficult to get information from their spokesperson, Tyler Hahn, as to what's going on in real time. But I keep getting reports of officers leaving and going to other agencies because they can't stand working here anymore for various reasons. So Chief Brackney is going to have to decide whether she stands with the mob in the community and is going to try to placate them, or whether she stands with her officers and the rule of law. Then we have Dr. Richardson, a guy who came to town on a platform of low taxes. Yes, in the interview that he had, there was a public interview of the final 3 candidates for city manager in Charlottesville. He actually said publicly that we have to be careful not to overtax people in real estate. I loved it. I don't think it played well with Mayor Walker. In fact, she told me she disagreed with that platform of the city manager, and yet he was hired anyway. So behind the scenes, apparently, Dr. Richardson was pushing for the rule of law, and it came out in a press release not long ago saying, hey, we're no longer going to tolerate violations of the rule of law in Charlottesville. We're going to start enforcing the law. Well, the very next day, apparently that was overridden, and Dr. Richardson looked foolish. And it wasn't long after that he was pushed out of his position, along with a $250,000 golden parachute. Dr. Richardson should have been willing to speak out publicly on his disagreements with the city council, because otherwise no one really knew where he stood, again trying to walk the line and losing everyone and everything. Now, amazingly, you're having these activists, all women of color, all who loudly and vociferously supported Mayor Walker, and I think even the police chief initially, Katrina Turner, Rosia Parker, and Tanisha Hudson, all now condemning the mayor and the police chief. A recent story in the daily newspaper, they said it's personal and getting more personal. This is not going to be healed. And of course, the mayor's getting her back up in all of this because she thought these were her friends and her supporters. It's what's called fair weather friends. That's a term we don't hear so much anymore, but it's exactly what's going on here. These activists, all women of color, talking about women of color, that would be the police chief and the mayor. These 3 women of color all commenting on 2 women of color, that would be the mayor and the police chief. When asked how to heal the relationship between the activists and the city, said, we need to get them out of their seats. That would be the mayor and the police chief. In many ways, we have lost, politically speaking, the fine art of listening to and respecting all sides. I tried to do that when I was in elected office, and it didn't always work, but most of the time it did. I tried to really listen to everybody and be respectful to them. But I think the ability to do that has been lost today because violent mobs have been fed by the capitulation of people who shouldn't have given in. Then that way, they have an expectation, the mobs, that if they just get louder and more violent, they eventually will win. We're seeing it all across America today, and they're now demanding here in Charlottesville that the mayor and the police chief give in to them and do what they want rather than those 2 individuals, or in this case also the city manager, doing what their mind and heart tells them to do. One of my favorite songs as a kid was Rick Nelson's Garden Party. You remember Ricky Nelson from Ozzie and Harriet? Well, one of his last hits, I think it was about 1973, was a song called Garden Party. And I never really understood exactly what happened, but in the song, he went to a party to play some music, and he was playing some stuff that people didn't know, and no one even recognized him. He was trying to please the audience and ended up pleasing nobody. And so the lesson and the key line in the song was, you can't please everyone, so you've got to please yourself. That is a true lesson for life. If you tell the truth, at least you know who your friends are, and they know who you are. And that's a lesson for the mayor, the police chief, and the city manager, and the activists. You can't please everyone, so you got to please yourself. The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues in a moment.
Support this podcast online at shillingshow.com.
Border BorderHawk.news is a one-stop shop with the latest news about immigration nationalism and globalism. The BorderHawk staff daily curates immigration news stories and, in the fashion of the Drudge Report, updates the site with cutting-edge content and original first-class commentary. BorderHawk.news highlights national and international media reports, tweets, and nuggets buried in local news blurbs, polls, video clips, and policy research. BorderHawk is pro-legal immigration, pro-rule of law, but against an unsecure border, as countless Americans have suffered violence at the hands of criminal illegal aliens. And an increasing number of Americans are concerned about how mass migration affects their daily life. BorderHawk.news will remain on the forefront of the immigration issue with a buffet of info to read, evaluate, and share. Bookmark BorderHawk.news. Add them on social media at BorderHawkNews on Twitter.
Get your fix. Schilling Show Unleashed.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues. Rick Green joins us, the founder of ConstitutionCoach.com. And today's topic is constitutional self-defense. And we mean that in many ways. Rick, welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed.
My pleasure, man. Thanks for having me.
All right. I want to talk first of all about the fundamental importance of the U.S. Constitution, because I think that's where we need to start the conversation.
Yeah, look, we see the failure of our society not teaching our principles, our values, what our country is about, what we stand for, and the lack of civics is really the core underlying festering problem of the last 50 years. You see it in the COVID crackdowns, governors out of control and running states as dictators. You see it in the craziness in the streets and the violence and the rioting and the Marxism that has been taught for years in our education system, now spilling over into the streets. And it really is that simple. It comes back to that basic idea of who are we as a country? What do we hold dear? What are our values? We don't teach our kids the greatness of America. We only teach them the mistakes that America has made. And so everything that's happening is really, kind of logical. It's a natural progression when you ignore those things. So the good news is it has been a combination in 2020 to wake people up and go, wait a minute. And so we're getting overwhelmed with requests for learning the Constitution, people actually wanting to study where we came from. And so Constitution Coach is all about making that fun. It's not your typical boring, that high school government class that you slept in because it was so boring, right? I hated the history and Constitution and government back then. And so we make it exciting and fun, bring history to life and make it applicable to people's lives.
So, Rick, I want to go to two things that you just mentioned. The first one is the schools. And so we here have locally, and I just published a story on our local government schools in Albemarle County teaching that the United States Constitution in its foundation is a racist document that was built on the concept of inequity. Now, when you're starting like that and you're sending kids through, 12 years of brainwashing, because that's starting in kindergarten, how do you reverse that, or what do you do to mitigate?
Yeah, it's, one of the things that we're pushing for is 10,000 people to run for local school boards to get in on the meat of this and make these changes. We worked for years with state boards of education to deal with the standards in history and what's being taught there. But it's a travesty the way that we lie to these kids, because what happens is, instead of teaching the good, the bad, and the ugly, teach the whole picture and teach it in context. We pull things out and make it look like America, instead of being the exceptional nation that de Tocqueville referred to, and the exception to the rule in terms of being great. They make us look like we were the exception in terms of being evil. And instead of saying, wait a minute, there was slavery in every nation on the planet, that we were one of the leaders to end that our people actually were the first ones to even give the citizens the ultimate control, that we were led by we the people instead of a monarch. Every country in the world, power came from God to a king, and then from the king to the people. Our founders reversed that and said power comes from God to the people, and then the people set up government to secure these rights and these freedoms. And that ultimately those things that were guaranteed in the Constitution and in the Declaration of Independence would be given to all Americans, men and women, black and white. But of course it took years. We had to change our nation as we changed the entire world. And the context is important. The way the story is told is important. I think we've ignored it for too long. As parents, we just sent our kids off to these schools and hoped that someone else would do a better job. and that they would take care of it. Our constitutions, our state constitutions around the country specifically say that our education system was created and designed for the purpose of churning out good citizens, to have informed citizens that could then vote well because they knew what freedom was all about. We have failed miserably in that in the last 50 years, and it's going to take citizens paying attention to it and actually getting into the fight, actually going and running for school board, paying attention to what's happening in that local school. Even if you homeschool or private school, you still got to pay attention to what's happening in the public schools, because that's where 80% of the kids are, which means that's where 80% of the voters are going to be.
You're exactly right. We're talking with Rick Green, constitutioncoach.com. So I want to go to the second part of the question. That has to do with the governors. We have a particularly out of control, maniacal tyrant here in Virginia by the name of Ralph Northam. I did my part the best I could. I've been involved in 2 lawsuits in suing the governor. Unfortunately, the judiciary is corrupt as well. They're not abiding by the Constitution. So what are we to do about these governors?
Rob, the way you just described that, I feel like I just found my spirit animal in Virginia. We're on the same page, my man. Oh, I'm doing the exact same thing in Texas. I wish I could say Republican governors were doing better, but my Republican governor in Texas, I'm on 5 lawsuits against this guy. He started off doing it well, being measured, not doing these stay-at-home orders, these unconstitutional, unprecedented. I mean, we've never done anything like this in our history, even with Spanish flu when it was 25 times more deadly, or smallpox 300 times more deadly. It's just insane what they're doing. I mean, it's supposed to be 3 branches, checks and balances. Legislatures should have had a say in this very quickly. Courts should have been striking this down and saying, you don't have a compelling interest that rises to this level. You're not narrowly tailoring this thing. It's not least restrictive. I mean, all the things that we used to do. I mean, one of the few, actual purposes of the court to keep in check things like this. And, I was wrong. I mean, back in March, I was making videos on the, constitutionality of what government can do in a pandemic. Where are the lines? How does this get done? And I said back then, these things are going out of control fast, but don't worry. There are judicial remedies here and courts will strike this stuff down. I can't believe we are 7 months into this thing. Mm-hmm. We finally got a good federal decision last week out of Pennsylvania. That judge said everything that you've probably been saying on the air and that I've been saying on the air, and struck down Governor Wolf in Pennsylvania's orders for all the same reasons that we've been suing over in our states. And so I'm hoping that's the first domino to fall, and other courts are going to hopefully do the same thing. But it is crazy that we've gone this long. We literally, I mean, I hate to say it, we lost our minds. I mean, we are doing things that no sane people would do. There's a verse in the Bible that says, professing themselves to be wise, yes, they became fools. And that's us.
It's exactly what we're seeing. Rick Green, let's go on to the importance. We talked about the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, because I talk about that a lot every year. I have a live reading of the Declaration of Independence on my program, just so people remember what the grievances were, because I see parallels in today's society.
Good for you, man. Oh, I love it. I love it. That's so needed, because the Declaration often gets forgotten, even when someone starts getting interested in the Constitution. So one of the first things we do, and in all of our Constitution classes, our first night is entirely devoted to the Declaration, because, as John Quincy Adams said, that's the foundation. That's, in our terminology today, that's the slab that the home is built upon. The Constitution is the home itself and how we're going to run our country. But the Declaration is the philosophy. This is who we are. This is why we're doing what we're doing. And so I've got a whole book on it called Freedom's Frame, and it specifically details, what are the founding principles of America, the concepts of our truth. The one of my reactions to the whole Black Lives Matter things initially was, you don't get life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness in the Declaration before you get to truth. It starts with, well, not starts, but the second paragraph, we hold these truths to be self-evident. You've got to start with truth. And I'm so disappointed in our churches and in so many leaders around the country that jumped on this Marxist bandwagon, not realizing you need to be grounded in truth before you make these accusations about America. So I think if everybody was to do what you've been doing, that's how you save the country. In fact, you're doing exactly, and no wonder you're doing it, you're in Virginia, exactly what George Mason said we should do. He said, you're not going to have a free government. No free government, nor the blessings of liberty can be preserved to any people, but by a frequent recurrence to fundamental principles. And that's what you're doing when you do that reading of the Declaration. It's that civic duty, that civic virtue. You're bringing back, you're having a frequent recurrence to those basic principles so that, I mean, we all need this, not just the kids. We all need to be reminded what actually works, what produces a free society, a prosperous society. You've got to know what's on the other side of the equation. If you want the result of liberty, if you want the result of freedom, you've got to know what the inputs are to get there. And that's what we're trying to get people to understand. And to be frustrated about this because people didn't want to pay attention to it. Yeah. But man, I'm almost thankful for a lot of this craziness of 2020 because the response is overwhelming. We've now got almost 2,500 coaches, Constitution coaches that are hosting classes in their living rooms, their churches, online. I mean, wherever they can. Some of them have 2 or 3 people in the room with them. Some of them have 200 or 300 people coming in. And so hundreds of thousands of people are going through this. I really believe this, Rob, if we can get millions, and I don't mean hundreds of millions, you don't need everybody. The founders, you had 3% that actually fought for the American Revolution. But if we can get a few million people to go through these Constitution courses, begin to study the Declaration like you've been teaching people to do, I believe that can save our nation. That's how you save the constitutional republic. But you've got to have the intellectual ammunition in order to wage this battle.
Rick Green, on your website, you mentioned types of rights, and I think it's important to go briefly into each one of these because people often don't make the distinction. Let's talk about legal, moral, and physical defense rights.
The burning question, I think, for a lot of people right now is what can I do? What are my rights? If I end up in a mob situation, if I end up with violence being perpetrated on me, what can I do to defend my family? I don't want to end up like a lot of these people across the country getting arrested, losing their weapons, losing their rights, even when they were just doing what a law-abiding citizen absolutely should do. And what the founders called the first law of nature. They believe this ability to defend yourself and your family in the moment, your ability as a people to defend against a tyrannical government, that was a law of nature. That wasn't something the government gave us. That's why the Declaration talks about laws of nature and nature's God. And so what we're trying to do is at the website, constitutioncoach.com, just give people real quick some little tidbits of information, right? Some little 3 and 4 minute videos about those basic fundamental rights. And if you're not ready to dive into a full course or whatever, then just go on the website and watch one video a day for 3 minutes, and you'll begin to learn the founders thought about this and how we apply it today, some of those basic concepts of these rights. And then as you get further into it, you'll see where it is enshrined in our Constitution. You'll see where they backed it up. I give just dozens and dozens and dozens of quotes from the founding fathers on this basic idea of the legal right to defend yourself. And then we also give some resources for individual states, it's a little different across the country. There's a general right of self-defense. There's certainly a constitutional right of self-defense. But different states have, some have stand your ground, some have the castle doctrine. So we give links to all of that so people can look it up in their particular state. And we call it bursts of education. So go on there in 3 minutes at a time, start learning. And then you can get into, if you want to, come spend some time with us. I mean, you can do a live class online. In fact, I'm starting another 6-week course that we'll do once a week on Monday nights. That's free. Anybody can sign in, and we do it live. We watch some of the videos together, and then I take questions with some of my other friends that are really into this. You can sign up there. You can do a class online. You can host a class. Even our Constitution Coach training is free right now. So everything we're giving it all away in 2020, Rob. I guess when I watched the McCloskeys defending their home against the mob, and on one hand, the courage that they had to do that. On the other hand, the poor firearms training that they had obviously did not have. And I thought, if we had more people with the good training so that it showed up whenever, when that video happens, you can tell this person knows what they're doing with their firearm. It would give more confidence to the basic idea that it's the citizen that has to be prepared to defend. You can't count on the police. I'm a back the blue guy all the way. But we used to say, when you need police in seconds, they're there in minutes. Now they may not even be coming because of our feckless politicians that are telling them to stand down, that are defunding them, demoralizing them. It's crazy what's happening. But even the founder said you can't count on government to defend yourself. You are responsible for defending yourself. So anyway, sorry for rambling, but I get kind of riled up when I start thinking about all the people out there that need this, and that's why we're giving it away.
Yeah, Rick, this is so important because we're seeing the same push to defund the police and the push for gun control concurrently here in Central Virginia and actually in the entire state. So how do those two things work? They're telling us that, one, we don't need police to defend us, and then they're telling us we're not going to let you have a gun to defend yourself.
Your problem, Rob, is you think logically. Remember what, it hasn't even been a year that we've heard those arguments of, you don't need that gun. That's what the police are for. You don't need that gun. That's what the government is for. Michael Bloomberg just a year ago was saying that and saying it's the police that should have the right to do these things, and you shouldn't be able to make those decisions. And even Joe Biden, back when my friend Stephen Williford saved the day at Sutherland Springs, 26 had been killed. This crazy guy was executing them one by one. Stephen heard the gunshots, ran over, stopped the guy. Joe Biden said that Stephen should, not the bad guy, but Stephen should not have been allowed to have the AR-15 that he used to stop that carnage. It's just crazy, their philosophy. It certainly doesn't make sense. But again, we don't teach people to think anymore, so they buy into these feel-good slogans of these politicians. You're right on the money. You have to have the right to defend yourself. You can't expect the police to be everywhere. And now, more than ever, the craziness of defunding the police. And the results are happening very quickly, right? We're already seeing it in New York and everywhere else where they've done this. Crime is going through the roof. I was so proud of our Attorney General, Barr, actually, basically, I forget the terminology, that he designated these cities as anarchy. And we're not going to send our federal money in there. These politicians make the decisions to destroy their cities. Why should we be paying for it? People are leaving these blue cities in droves, and there's no reason that the rest of us should have to pay for the carnage that the politicians have created.
Rick, there's a dilemma that people face, and I had this conversation privately with one of my listeners a couple days ago, but I've been thinking about this for years personally. There are people now who are fearful of registering for a concealed carry permit, of obtaining this permit, for fear that the list will be used against them in the future, or that the list may wind up in the hands of people who mean us harm. And I'd love to get your take on this.
Well, it's a legitimate concern. I don't dismiss that at all. I think it's a tough decision that every individual has to make. There are some states where it's not necessary, that you have actual constitutional carry and there's no need to go through that process. That's growing by leaps and bounds, which is a really good thing. You wouldn't believe how hard we had, in Texas, we don't even have that yet. So I hope that movement continues, because you're right. There is always anybody that thought America could never go that direction. Just look at what's happening in our country right now, and there's a legitimate reason to be concerned about that. But then the trade-off, the practical, to be able to defend my family, to be able to carry not only in my state, but as much as I travel across the country to the states that have reciprocity, I made the decision that I would do it and take that chance. Fortunately, there's not an actual registry where they don't know how many guns I have, but you're right. It's a bit of a conundrum, and I wish it wasn't that way, but that's one of those things that for me, it's worth that risk in order to deal with an immediate situation if I have to. It's kind of that old be judged by 12 instead of carried by 6, and making sure that the immediate threat that I'm ready for, and I'll take that risk on the other front. But at the same time, fighting for ending that and getting rid of those restrictions and moving towards constitutional carry.
Rick Green, you mentioned earlier briefly our churches and the churches that are really falling away. And I think it should be a cause of great concern for Americans, particularly those who have a Christian worldview. So what do we do about these churches, and what do we do if we're in one of these churches, say, that says, hey, you're not allowed to carry in the church, or, we don't believe in that, or we're supporting Black Lives Matter? Does the Christian stay in the church and fight to right the church, or go to a different place?
Again, it's an individual decision. I wouldn't ask people to do what I'm not willing to do. And, Rob, I left my church this summer. I could not believe that they'd been so solid on so many things, but they quickly jumped on this bandwagon. Pastors wearing the 1619 Project hat, the white privilege, mantra. I could not believe that they so quickly fell for the virtue signaling. And the lack of, it was absolutely unbiblical. Paul made it very clear for us that there is no race in the kingdom of God. And so we left. It was very frustrating. It was a combination, honestly, of that and the refusal to open up and defy the governor's orders, and start bringing people together and stop forsaking the fellowship of the believers. So, we made that decision. I'm not going to say to anybody else that they have to make that decision, because there is a trade-off, right? There is the ability to still influence that church if your leaders are willing to listen, and if there's, an open dialogue there, at least to push them in the right direction. But honestly, Rob, I'm starting to look at the church like I look at the university system and saying we have to defund the left. And when the left has come in and taken over your church, that's not the place you want to be putting your dollars or your time or your energy. There are other believers out there that want to gather together and seek truth. And a lot of times it's just these churches getting too big and too bureaucratic. Man, that's a whole nother discussion. But I'm the same way about college. I'm saying, let's stop sending our kids to these schools. I'm for defunding the left at the university level. My state gives $20 billion a year to these leftist indoctrination camps, and we've got to stop that. And it begins with us as individuals. And say that, on paper that looks hypocritical because I've got 2 degrees from public universities in Texas. My son has a master's from Texas A&M, the Bush School there, that used to be the conservative university in Texas, but they've all gone left wing. There's very few left, and it's almost all private universities and even a lot of our Christian universities. And I don't want to depress people by saying all and all that. Look, if you do your homework, you can find the right place to send your kids, or do the online universities. Liberty and others have fantastic programs. Save the money. Get the degree if you need it, but most careers you don't even need it anymore. It's like, why do we continue to waste hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt and 4 years of our lives, and when you could be going out there and doing what it is that those schools are going to tell you about. So I do think people should make that decision to find somewhere where the church is not going to try to make the Bible somehow fit the culture. It's time to make the culture fit the Bible. We got to stop trying to wrap ourselves around whatever's popular out there. Standing for truth sometimes isn't popular, but it moves, it convicts, it's supposed to convict. And that's what, think about it, that's what the Pilgrims did. That's why they didn't have slavery. That's why, they imprisoned the slave holders when the ship ended up there. That's why, they moved towards free enterprise and private property and away from socialism, because as they were reading that Geneva Bible, they let it convict them and they let it teach them, and they started forming society towards the Bible instead of the other way around. That starts with us as individuals, and your tithe, your dollars, your education dollars, all of those things. You vote with your dollars, just like you vote with your feet. If you're in a place that's refusing to change and move towards freedom and towards these things, then move somewhere else in the country that where you can make a difference. And we're going to have to start having some havens of liberty in different states across the country, I think.
I'm thinking the same thing, and I have talked with I think his name is Daniel from the Texas Nationalist Movement in your state a number of times on the air, looking at this future of America and saying we're going to have to go back, first of all, to where the states have greater sovereignty. And second of all, finding a safe haven. There's so many times that people call me up, Rick, and say, hey, where can we go? We want to get out of here, but we have no idea where to go. And it doesn't really appear that there is a place like that, at least not yet.
Isn't that disappointing? I mean, I'm usually such an optimist, but this COVID thing has just shocked me. I am amazed at the conservative states that just went off the cliff. I got to say, Kristi Noem, South Dakota, they did it right. And she led. I'm going to write a book about her leadership through this whole thing because it was phenomenal. And I had a chance to have, and you should try to get Larry Roden, her lieutenant governor, on if you can. It was so neat to hear how, and honestly, I think another rabbit trail here, but I think a big chunk of that is because both of them, Kristi Noem and Larry Roden, have a ranching background. They both run ranches. And there's something about, when you come from the country and your actions every day, you have to live with those consequences and you have to solve those problems, and you can't blame other people. It's up to you. There's something about that changes your philosophy and the way you deal with things. And they did it right. No shutdowns, no stay-at-home orders, no mask mandates. I mean, none of that nonsense. And they are benefiting greatly as a result right now. Maybe there are a few models out there, but I get it all the time. People asking me, hey, is Texas going to secede? Should we move there? And I've always said over the years, I've traveled and done these Constitution classes, look, it wasn't just Texans that died for me at Iwo Jima, and even at the Alamo, it wasn't just Texans. So I've taken a national sense and said, look, we got to fight for the whole country. We need patriots in every state. But I'm honestly starting to think, man, we need some enclaves. We need some areas that are really strong so that they can set the example, so that then these states that are going off the cliff, when they finally come to their senses and the rubble is sitting around, they know how to pick up the pieces and rebuild. And I don't know yet where those places are going to be, but I do still believe in individuals across the whole nation taking responsibility. Start these Constitution classes. Send your kids to our Patriot Academies. We do these 1-week trainings in state capitals across the country where they come in and learn a founding father's philosophy of government. And they can come train with us. With this constitutional defense course is a fun time to physically train. And because regardless of what happens with the government and all the different things that are up in the air right now, you're always going to need to be able to defend your family, because there's always going to be evil in the world. And you've got to be the one prepared. You can't count on government to do that for you. And we make it really fun. So come out and physically train with us, or find somebody local if you can. We're the biggest and the best. We train 30,000 people a year. Incredible facility that we have out in Pahrump, Nevada to do this. It's not our facility, it's Front Sight, but we partnered with them. I'm their Constitution coach. And the cool thing is, you shoot all day on the range and get that training, but then in the evening, we dive into the Constitution and we get the intellectual ammunition. So if you want to come for free, it's a $1,000 course and you can come for free. Defense2020.com. But the Constitution coach training is all free at the main website. Sorry to confuse a little on that.
Not at all. Rick Green, I appreciate what you're doing for the country and for individuals across the country who are trying to reclaim it. Thanks so much for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed. Truly appreciate it.
Hey, Rob, appreciate you, man. You are a Paul Revere out there. Keep shouting the warning, keep training people, keep teaching them. I appreciate you, man.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at shillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time.